everyone, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live. My name is Catherine, I'm the director for the Business of Data team here at Premium. The sun has just come out here in Cardiff, well, so I do bid you a very happy Thursday. Now, just as we do every week, we are going to live stream our podcast episode. So, as always, get those comments and questions in, we'd love to see them and make sure we can feed them back to our guests. And if you would like to appear on the podcast, then please do let me know. I would love to hear from you. But for now, let's tune into this week's episode.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Data podcast. My name is Catherine King and I'll be your host. Welcome to season 3. It's absolutely lovely to have you joining us. In this series, we will be talking to executives and thought leaders from a range of industries, departments and functions, all about their passions, experiences and challenges within data and analytics. Let's go ahead and dive straight into today's episode. Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Business of Data podcast episode. This week we are zeroing in on overcoming the challenge of data sharing, specifically how to bring data assets together to solve complex problems. Now, when I was thinking about this topic, I just knew I had to chat with Carlos Rivero, who is the Chief Data Officer for Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, I was lucky enough to meet Carlos a couple of years ago at one of our events, and I've been really fortunate to keep up with him since, so I'm so glad he could join me today. Now, if you haven't had the privilege of meeting Carlos, just a couple of facts to bring you up to speed. So, as I say, Carlos has been the CDO for the Commonwealth of Virginia since August 2018. And before that, he has held roles in NOA Fisheries, Federal Transit Administration and Barry University as well. That's quite a mouthful. I'll let myself off for that. Now, if you can't find him at his work desk, you'll most likely find him outside taking part in a plethora of outdoor activities, from paddleboarding to hiking and even parachuting, I am told, on one occasion, which sounds very exciting. Carlos, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Catherine.
Now, as is the BoD Pod tradition, nosy question in first. Now, I said there in the start, you're very passionate about physical outdoor activities, but you're also quite passionate about others as well, such as meditation and yoga. What do you love so much about those?
Wow, so it really gives you a chance to explore internally what's going on in your inner world. So although I love exploring our outer world, but there's a lot going on inside as well. And so what happens inside shifts your perspective and kind of is the lens by which you see life through. And so having a better handle on what some of the issues are you have internally and how that distorts your view of the world kind of gives you that opportunity to really look at things from multiple perspectives, so that you don't come into this world thinking that only your thoughts are the only right thoughts, right? That there are other opinions, other experiences, other perspectives that you need to take into account. And that really helps a lot when you engage with people, especially when we talk about data sharing, because the biggest problems with data sharing are people problems, not technology problems. And I'm happy to get into any of that as we go along.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely going to be a theme I want to pick up with you a bit later. And I think that wellness and mindfulness is so important, especially with just the chaos that is going on, continued at the moment. It doesn't even matter when this episode airs. I'm sure there's going to be a level of chaos that we're dealing with, because that just seems to be the theme at the moment. So having that mindfulness is so important. So thank you for starting us off in such a positive way, Carlos. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's start by talking about the challenges of data sharing in government administrations and the sector in general. What's so unique about it?
Wow. So, I mean, one of the things that we really think about is how is it different from the private sector, right? And so in the private sector, and, you know, there are some nuances, but in the private sector for most, you know, intent, it's pretty much controlled by the organization itself, right? And so, you know, there is a mission that's very specific, like it's either a for-profit driven mission, or, you know, you have your shareholders that, you know, are really driving the decisions that are being made by the board. And so there is that kind of, you know, we have this one focus and we're all going to focus on that. And although there are obstacles to data sharing, for the most part in government agencies, many agencies operate autonomously, right? And we know that the leadership changes regularly, right? And so if you, and especially the executive leadership, so in Virginia specifically, we have a one-term governorship. So really, any governor that comes in really only has 4 years to implement their agenda. After that, everyone knows they're gone, right? They're not going to get reelected because there is no opportunity for that. And so in this type of scenario where you have these different government agencies that are acting somewhat autonomously and have to for the continuity of government services, when you as an executive come in with these new ideas and new mandates, it's very difficult to implement those if you push too hard, right? Because if you push too hard and create a whole lot of chaos within the agencies, then they may sit back and say, this too shall pass, right? And so you have to be very, very tactful in the way that you implement these policies and look at how those agencies are going to receive these new vision that you have for their operations.
Absolutely. Already you can see that kind of people and culture challenge really creeping into what, it should really be an infrastructure problem. It should be, how can we do this safely and effectively? But actually, like you say, many companies in the private sector could face a leadership change. They could face a shift in plan and strategy, but you're guaranteed it. It's not
Yes.
if it could. So you're going to have to shift with the times. So I think that just layer on top of those already inbuilt challenges that everyone could experience, you're going to receive them, and it really depends on those different leaders' approaches and how they're going to deal with that. So I'm also keen, whilst we're talking about challenges that everyone has experienced, I'm keen to know whether the demand for data has increased internally for you as well. I know from speaking to many members of the private sector that certainly COVID and all the other challenges we faced recently has really increased the demand for data. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely increased exponentially. And I think one of the funny things, and it's an old adage, but it's like, what is the reward for good work? More work, right? And so that's essentially what's happening, is that as we evolve and develop all of these different capabilities and bring in data assets from all kinds of different organizations, many organizations are starting to say, hey, there's something really good happening here. I want to participate. I want in. And mind you, we have 63 executive branch agencies within the Commonwealth of Virginia, plus 133 localities that I'm technically responsible for, right? And making sure that they all play nice in the sandbox and building out the infrastructure and the processes and the governance model to help bring all of those people together to move this stuff forward. And you can't do that. You can't boil the ocean, right? You can't do that all at the same time. You really have to pick and choose what your battles are, get that momentum going, and start building up that critical mass as you start to move forward. And that's where we are right now, is building up that critical mass, where a lot of different agencies that were not necessarily part of our original plan to kind of bring them in have volunteered to come in and participate. And that's a great place to be. Yeah. But again, it's more work, right? And so you have to be able to manage that with the limited personnel that we have.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that you say there's, you solve one challenge, which is getting the buy-in and getting people excited about it. And then the next challenge that appears of how to control that excitement and make sure everyone's running in the same direction. So as you say, you replace challenges with challenges, but it's all very good. So that's the scene set for us. What I am keen to do now is turn the conversation to understand what you've been doing to overcome some of these data sharing challenges at the Commonwealth.
Wow. So initially, when I first came on board, there were four main, well, the first thing I did was listen, right? Just really pay attention to, number one, the culture of the organization, where the personalities were that we needed to really kind of massage and work with, and really just address the people and culture aspect of it. And not so much addressing in terms of like, what are the things we need to do to change it, but really just learn it, right? Yeah. What is the culture and how does it function? And every agency has its own culture. So even though we are one organization, but there really are little families of agencies that kind of operate in their own way and have their own unique culture. And so being able to get a better understanding of where we were in that regard, and then start to look at, okay, what are some of the things that are going to help us move forward? And so there were four main initiatives that I worked on. Number one was governance. Establish a governance framework that allowed people to participate in the discussion of how we best leverage our data assets. And really, at the end of the day, that's what governance is all about, is engaging participation in the discussion, right? And having that communication established between all the different parties involved in the data evolution, right? In the data management cycle. So you're talking about technical folks at the stewards level, but you're also talking about data owners in the Data Governance Council. You're also talking about executives at the Executive Data Board, executive leadership in each of the different agencies. And then you're also talking about state leaders in the Virginia Data Commission that are, our legislators, our senators, our cabinet secretaries working together to really identify what are some complex overarching issues that we're trying to address at the Commonwealth-wide level that not one agency can address, right? These are multidisciplinary issues that we want to tackle as a Commonwealth, and then be able to translate those into different agency performance targets that the individual agencies can start to work on, right? So that's the governance model. And then in addition to that, working on data discovery. How do we make our data assets more discoverable? Right? We have over 2,300 applications in production right now across the Commonwealth. Amongst those 2,000 applications, each one easily has hundreds, if not thousands, of data elements. Being able to take information from those different data systems and make them discoverable. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to put everything out there, because there's a lot of stuff in there that may not be relevant to everyone, but at least be able to identify what are the highest value data assets that we want to be able to let everyone know, hey, this is what we have, and let's make a path to how do we get access to it in a wide variety of ways. Then the next thing after that is building out trust, right? We need it. So once we establish relationships and communications, we then have to cultivate trust. And so in the trust model is being able to work with the Office of the Attorney General to create the Commonwealth Data Trust, which is our legal framework for identifying the roles and responsibilities of all of the entities involved in the data sharing relationship. So when you talk about those entities, you're talking about, when you abstract that out, it's the data provider, the data recipient, and the individuals that work for the data recipient that actually have their hands on the keyboard, eyes on the data, working with that restricted use data. And in the middle of all that is the trustee, who brokers, catalyzes that relationship and being able to move that forward. And so that's what the Commonwealth Data Trust is all about, is that legal framework that facilitates confidence and trust in our ability to manage these restricted use sensitive data assets. And then lastly was talent. We really wanted to be able to create a conveyor belt of data talent, starting with our academic institutions. So even coming out of high school into the community college, which is early post-secondary education, we started with the Rural IT Apprenticeship Program, and being able to develop a program where individuals in rural communities can start participating in our data documentation efforts, so they can learn not just about data and data technologies, but about the business of government. So while they're working on documenting our data assets, they're really learning about what are the business processes that the government uses to drive the collection of those data assets. So that's that's a great education in and of itself. But then if they decide to go on to a four-year college or university, they can then participate in the Commonwealth Data Internship Program, which is a program that we have to connect. It's almost like a matchmaking service, if you will, that connects students and faculty at different academic institutions with the tools and the skills with agencies that have problems in data, right? And being able to bring those two together to identify what data problems can we solve with student labor, right? And be able to give students real world professional experience in being able to solve some, complex problems using, technologies that they have access to, and then be able to translate that back to the agency. So that's really what I've been working on for, the past 2 years. And there's a lot of other things that go around into that, but essentially those are the four driving forces.
I really love that layered approach, actually. And at the top of your answer there, when you say about listening, I couldn't help but think about that almost that meditative process of just being within the organizations, within the agencies, and just listening and understanding the culture to then be able to go on and do those things. And it's certainly something I hear a lot from executives like yourself, is actually don't just charge in with an idea of, right, this is how we're going to do it. Because as you say, each of those agencies has a very different culture. So what is going to work for one would be thrown out the door quicker than you can say, hey, let's try this in another. So I think that's so important. Now, another important aspect to making any change or dealing with any challenge is really identifying successes. Obviously, as you say, understanding who those champions are and who's going to really sell your story is one side, but then giving them a success story to sell is also very important. So what successes have you seen so far from doing all of these elements that you just laid out?
Wow. So FACT, our framework for addiction analysis and community transformation, is one of our successes in the Commonwealth. This disorder project that is originally focused on opioids, but obviously it's expanded a lot more than just the opioid epidemic. And it was actually mandated by the legislation that created my position, that I work on a pilot project that demonstrates the efficiency and efficacy of using data to solve a complex problem, specifically opioids. And so what we did was we started with a very small community in Northwest Virginia called Winchester. And in that community, we were looking at that as a microcosm for what happens in the larger scale across the Commonwealth with regards to data sharing, but then deriving intelligence from the data assets that are being collected from a wide variety of different organizations. So when you think of the opioid problem, you know, it isn't a one-dimensional problem, right? It isn't a law enforcement problem. It isn't just a health science problem. It isn't just a community problem. It's an overall problem that has multiple facets to it. And so being able to connect with a council that has multiple representatives from each of these different industries, you know, participating in it, one of the biggest concerns was, how do we share data, right? How do we actually share the intelligence? And so we came in and were able to say, okay, well, first we need to establish trust, and then started with the Commonwealth Data Trust Model. And that was the precursor to what eventually became the Commonwealth-wide Data Trust Model. But started with that, working with those different individuals, then implementing the technology that facilitates the consolidation of those data assets, and then being able to leverage that consolidated platform to build up the warehousing and the intelligence, and then turn that around and say, okay, here's the intelligence you need to make better data-driven decisions for each of your unique perspectives, right? And then at the end of the day, our main focus has always been in that project to empower the individuals to make better decisions, regardless of where they are in that process. And so as a result of that, not only have we expanded out to Roanoke and also the Southwest Virginia area, but we are now expanding out to 4 different regions across the Commonwealth for data onboarding, in addition to 4 additional regions for user onboarding. Because in the past year and a half, we've actually onboarded statewide data assets that are now making intelligence available to the Commonwealth in general. So you no longer have to provide your data as a region into the platform to get value out of it. Because we've incorporated statewide data assets, now anyone across the Commonwealth can be a user on the platform and generate intelligence from the statewide data assets that we have. So that was one of the things. And then we took the lessons learned from that and moved it over to our workforce data trust. And so we now have a workforce, we have the workforce referral portal, which previously, if you wanted to get access to workforce services, you as an individual had to physically go to a workforce service center and then ask, I need help, right? But what kind of help do you need? I need training, I need certification, I need a job, I need unemployment insurance, right? There's a whole spectrum of different services we provide in that space. But if you as a citizen don't know that everything, then what you ask for is very limited, right? And so depending on who you talk to, you may get the full, you know, ensemble of everything we have, or you may just get exactly what you need. And so we decided to say, no, that's a very arcane system. Let's create a web-based portal where an individual can come in, and then based on the answers that they have to certain questions, we can then offer them a wide variety of different services. Not only do we offer them the services, we automatically create accounts in those services and then turn the table. So before, you as a requester were responsible for going out and asking and following through and contacting. But because of the way we architected the system, those agencies now have the information they need to contact you. And it's up to them to reach out to you. And then we're capturing those metrics. This request came in, how long did it take you to contact them? What was the outcome, right? So we're able to track all of that. And that's all based on the lessons learned from the FACT project. And ultimately, from the workforce, we took all of that and implemented it for the COVID-19 pandemic response. So what you're seeing is an evolution, a very fast evolution of the data trust, the governance framework, the technology platforms, like all of the components that go together to make data sharing, analytics, and intelligence.
But I mean, that work must have been invaluable to then dealing with COVID, because the demand for data and the need to be able to make quick decisions and effective decisions and communicating well as well. You know, it wasn't a case that you can have mixed messages. Everyone needs to know what they need to do and quickly, and obviously data is behind that. So I can imagine that really did really set you up for success compared to if you hadn't been able to have had these experiences prior to that. Now, I'm keen to know, we've used the word data quite a bit, but I'm keen to know if you've been using any alternative or external data to supplement the work that you're doing as well, so not just your own as well.
Oh, absolutely. So, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, we needed data from our hospitals, right? But our hospitals don't belong to the Commonwealth organization, right? They're not part of state government. They are private organizations, and they have a private association, the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association, that is their kind of unifying body, if you will, right? And so working with VHHA, we were able to quickly turn around the data trust agreement get them to become members of the data trust. And then, I mean, they signed it on March 29th.
Wow.
Data started to flow March 30th. By April 6th, we had the dashboard ready to go with all of their data, with the number of beds, the number of ventilators, the number of ICU patients that they had, and what percentage of those were COVID-19, and being able to look geographically across the entire Commonwealth, and then within specific localities, and even down to the institution level, what their statuses were, so that we can tell, what we can determine whether they were being overwhelmed or not. And so, as a result of our hard work on some of those previous projects that we talked about, we were able to quickly have, you know, a legal document that we can share with the private organization, have their lawyers review it, because usually, you know, data sharing, when we talk about legal data sharing, the legal aspects of data sharing, getting the lawyers to approve the terms and conditions of the sharing agreement itself can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months.
Yeah.
And
we don't have that time.
We don't have that time, right? And so fortunately for us, we were able to turn that 6 to 18 month into like 3 days.
Yeah.
And then the data started to flow. And that to me is I think is one of the most phenomenal success stories we've had.
Absolutely. And I think it goes to show why when you have an executive board who are perhaps really demanding a clear picture on return of investment for a set project, sometimes you can't determine that, because as you said, that data trust agreement has now absolutely doubled its value by being able to provide that copy paste activity to this pandemic. And like you said, a 3-day turnaround, come on, that's just mental. And you were able to do that because of that project. So like I say, that work you did previously suddenly becomes doubly as valuable because it's able to be used again, which I think is very, very interesting. Right, time is moving so quickly, and I'm keen to go on to my last topic area that I knew I wanted to chat to you about, Carlos. Now, as I say, and as you have said throughout this episode, you are definitely a people person, and people must come first when it comes to data. And I'm really keen to know, obviously we've touched on your personal life in the aspects of you know, being very aware to people and their needs, but why do you hold this view so highly when it comes to data and people?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it's a big part of my upbringing. I mean, I grew up in a very, you know, low-income environment, inner city environment in Miami, and you know, I witnessed myself firsthand a lot of injustice. So a lot of the racial and social injustice that we're addressing now, I experienced as a youngster, and not personally myself, like having it been done to me, but I see it amongst my friends, and you know, it's very disheartening when you can see that people are generally wanting to, you know, improve their station in life, but have all the cards stacked against them. And so I think injustice is one of those things that really hits home for me. And really the only way to overcome that is by being inclusive and incorporating people into the conversation. And so as I evolved in my career, and my career started in science, right, in ecology and NOAA fisheries, as you mentioned, and before that at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School, really looking at individual behavior, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, whether or not a person wears a mask, whether or not a person socially distances, makes a huge difference in regard to how that community is going to be impacted. And depending on the type of community, some communities are more resilient than others. And so being able to take all of that into account and incorporate the most objective data that you have. Now, mind you, a lot of data already has inherent bias because of the business processes that are used to generate that, and taking that into account, you still have to be able to empower people to make the best decisions possible. So for me, I think all of that comes from, you know, growing up in a low-income environment, seeing a lot of injustice happening all around me, and saying, how can we fix this? How can we fix the world? Which is crazy because, you know, it's like, you can't fix the world. You can only fix yourself. So anyway.
Absolutely. Now, to draw those together, you mentioned talent earlier and the issue of talent. Now, for many people who are laymen to the data world, when you think data, you think maths, statistics, coding, quite cold, I think is sometimes the attitude towards data, whether rightly or wrongly. And certainly something I've been hearing from the Business of Data Global Advisory Board, it came up on one of our discussions, is that increasingly the talent pool is needed to be more human in that aspect, that they're approaching topics with a very human mind, and that changes what you need in talent. Suddenly it's not necessarily the best coder, but someone who can think about these issues as a person. Now, I'm going to try and ask this question without kind of predicting the answer really, but do you think holding that people come first attitude really impacts and enables you to work through very people-centered issues? I mean, you've mentioned there the opioid crisis, incredibly human-centered, COVID, incredibly human-centered, and all of those challenges. Do you think when it comes to talent that we ought to be looking at these soft skills a little bit more than necessarily the more traditional data skills?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, without a doubt. And so I like to boil it down in what I call the data value chain, right? Because I think if you understand the data value chain, you really understand the people part of it a lot better. And so when you talk about the data value chain, really, what is data, right? Data is nothing more than bits and bytes, binary representation of things that are happening in the real world, right? So you take things that are happening in the real world, you crunch them down, you abstract them down into some bits and bytes that you're holding in a computer system. But when does it become valuable? Because as the data itself in the computer system is not very valuable until a human being interprets it. Someone from some perspective, whether it's health, environment, criminal justice, what have you, look at the data and then be able to look at the patterns and trends that they see in that data and be able to say, hey, this is what's going on. Then it becomes information, right? So it takes a human being to transfer data into information. But then what does it become? Knowledge. When you start to understand, when the human beings start to understand what are the mechanisms that are creating the patterns and trends that they're seeing in the information, then it becomes knowledge. And you have an understanding. The human being has an understanding of what's going on that's creating that data. And then lastly, when does it become intelligence? When you integrate that knowledge into the decision-making framework, that people are now able to make decisions on that information that's being driven by that data, then it becomes intelligence. So you can understand that the data part of it is just one step. There are 3 additional steps: the information, knowledge, intelligence, that are all people-centric. And that's what we need to focus on, is how do we guide that evolution from just bits and bytes of raw binary data into information, knowledge, and intelligence.
Absolutely, brilliant. So what is next for innovations for the Commonwealth of Virginia? What are you going to be working on next?
Wow, that is huge. So one of the things that we're doing is really building out a lot of these capabilities as services or solutions that we offer to our agencies. We don't want our agencies to have to lift all of the infrastructure and all the capabilities on their own. So we're creating a lot of these centralized shared services, especially for intelligence, right? Because a lot of agencies want to be able to build intelligence and intelligence products that help them make better decisions, as we've talked about, but they don't know how to do it. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the human resources. So what we're doing is we're creating that internally and then making it available to the agency. So we're consulting, we're advising, we're guiding, we're working with them, and then getting them to start becoming more proficient in building those solutions. But then when they built a solution that we can deploy in our production environment, we'll take that on. We have the infrastructure, we manage all that on their behalf, and then make it available. So that's the big thing that now we're working on, is really kind of cranking out those widgets and getting intelligence products delivered to our agencies.
Wonderful. So my last question to you, Carlos, before I let you get back to, I'm sure, a very busy day at the office, is if you were going to give a fellow chief data officer just one piece of advice to guide them over the next 12 months, what would it be?
Build relationships.
Wow, that was probably the snappiest answer we've had. Do you want to add anything else to that?
I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, is cultivating relationships, building up respect and trust with all of those individuals that you are there to serve. And I think that's a big difference, because many agencies feel like, you have the perspective that they need to give you stuff. And many ways they need to give you data because that's what you need to do your job. But in the reality, what you're there is to serve them. And I think if you come in with that perspective that you are there to be of service to those agencies, to help them on their journeys and build that relationship based on that, I think that will help pave the way for a lot more success.
Fantastic. As always, Carlos, it's a huge pleasure being able to catch up with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's been my pleasure.
There we go. We certainly covered a lot in just that one episode. I think government as a vertical sometimes gets a bad rap for being slow-paced or difficult to work within, especially compared to some of the other verticals we get to chat with here on the BoD Pod. I'm thinking financial services and tech, who are able to do things probably much quicker than government. But I think if there's one thing we can take from Carlos's message today, is the journey he's been on and continues to be on, and the amazing work that data analytics is able to achieve in this sector. As always, make sure you are subscribed to the Business of Data platform to be first in line for all of our thought-leading content, as well as our weekly newsletter. And do be sure to follow us on socials as well, so that you are notified when we go live, as well as all of the social posts and engaging with fellow thought leaders like yourself. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time.